Welcome back to Everything History for the third part of the English Revolution series, and this is episode 28, The Rise of William III.
I discharged my last duty as King and Emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
We left off just after the declaration of the Prince of Orange, in which William III declared his intention to invade the domains of his father-in-law. This expedition, as he and his counselors called it, was, quote, intended for no other design but to have a free and lawful parliament assembled, end quote. So, from the beginning, William was asserting that this wasn't about himself. This was about restoring the legislature of Parliament and relieving the British Isles of the poor leadership of James II. But, in all likelihood, that is simply a profound example of political propaganda from the 17th century. Now, how did James II and his Privy Council react? Well, after a long 2-month silence from the Dutch court, they fully expected an invasion, by sea obviously, and King James was confident that his land army could successfully oppose and destroy any such invasion by William. But the upkeep and maintenance of this large army prevented any expansion of the English navy. James's naval force was not small by any means, but they were not in a readied state. This was not necessarily a mistake, but it was very much the opposite strategy that Queen Elizabeth had deployed exactly a century prior against the Spanish Armada. Nevertheless, the English navy began to organize what they could to oppose the oncoming Dutch invasion. And when I say Dutch invasion, I do not mean that the entire force was made up of Dutch soldiers and sailors. Actually, the historian Nicholas Roger tells us that William's force would have been made up of an amalgamation of Dutch, English, Scottish, Swiss, German, Swedish, Austrian, and mercenary forces. So, William's invasion was quite representative of the entire League of Augsburg. Also, the time of the invasion was quite close to October. In Northern Europe, that is not exactly a great time to begin planning an invasion because winter could arrive within weeks and grind any military operations to a halt. By the time the invasion was readied in late October 1688, accounts described the winds of the English Channel and the North Sea as horrific and swirling in all directions. This was not exactly detrimental to William, however, because while his fleet would be difficult to launch, it would be equally difficult to repel. But before any of this could happen, William and his Dutch forces needed two things: an opening from King Louis XIV and favorable winds. What I mean by an opening from Louis is that France was about to launch war upon Northern Europe by the fall of 1688. This was quite apparent because talks had broken down and Louis was mustering troops near the Rhineland. But nobody knew whether he would invade into the Netherlands, the Rhineland, the Austro-Swiss Alps, or even as many truly feared, England itself. Thus this was a pivotal moment that was bound to bring great change in Europe, and William was well aware. So he waited for Louis to make his move and would not commit until he was absolutely sure where France would launch themselves, so he would not leave the Dutch Netherlands open to attack and ruin by accidentally leaving too early. The fates of many nations were on the line, and King Louis eventually came to the decision to invade the Rhineland and let William wear himself out in Britain. With that, the way was then clear for the Prince of Orange. In late October, over 450 ships of all sizes were launched with William aboard the flagship, with 25 to 40,000 being transported across the English Channel. Yet, immediately the conditions turned for the worst, and the fleet was forced to turn back to harbor with minimal losses. The invasion fleet was delayed by weeks as they waited for favorable weather again. And finally, in early November 1688, the skies cleared and William's fleet gained a strong prevailing wind. With the winds at their back, they relaunched their fleet. Everyone expected a great confrontation with James's fleet, but it was not to be, for William's fleet proved to be elusive. The English Navy was said to have spotted the fleet twice, but were unable to intercept the invading vessels, and within 2 days William crossed into the Strait of Dover, displaying full colors and regalia to the English coastline. On November 15th, the invasion landed at Torbay in southern England. With the crossing of the Channel complete, the business of revolution and war began in England and in Europe. The 9 Years' War was, of course, underway in Bavaria, and England looked primed to implode. The forces of both William and James were approximately of the same size, running somewhere around 30,000 strong, with many military historians believing James to have actually had the upper hand. Yet, oddly enough, the two armies would never meet in any full-scale confrontation, which, as you might imagine, is primarily the reason this quote-unquote glorious revolution is also nicknamed the Bloodless Revolution. And shortly after landing, William settled on a plan of attack. Confident in his popular support, William decided on a slow 200-mile march to London to allow the fires of revolution to spread across England. And as if on cue, rioting then began to ignite across England, and anti-Catholic, anti-royalist demonstrations erupted in the heart of London immediately after confirmation of the landing at Torbay. And the steady and slow approach by William was working wonders. His soldiers were well within their supply lines, and as the army marched, they began to gather up support from local towns and villages, and even deserters of King James's own soldiers. Within days, cities that were supposed to be garrisoned in the name of the king were opening their doors and gates to William, and high-level commanders soon began to desert to the Revolutionary Army at a rapid rate. On November 19th, though, it seemed as if the forces of James and William were about to meet. For at the city of Salisbury, King James had mustered an army of 20,000. But the situation deteriorated rapidly for the House of Stuart, in a manner that James could not even have expected. Because before William even arrived, soldiers in James's royal army were deserting at catastrophic proportions. Leading commanders as well, even generals in James's army. These included Lord Cornbury and Lord Churchill, both of whom had been counselors to James before their desertion on November 24th. Furthermore, Lord Churchill also defected with an astonishing 400 officers and left a letter of self-justification and apology for his king, which I will read a portion of now. Quote, "To desert your majesty at a time when your affairs seems to challenge the strictest obedience from all your subjects, much more from one who lies under the greatest personal obligation imaginable to your majesty. This, sir, could proceed from nothing but the inviolable dictates of my conscience and a necessary concern for my religion." End quote. And soon after, an even more devastating psychological blow struck James when another of his daughters, Princess Anne, publicly defected to William. For the royalists, though, the military situation was most horrifying because thousands of soldiers were openly abandoning King James II. And where were most of the soldiers going? Well, they weren't just walking 100 miles back to home, no. They were largely not only deserting, but converting to the army and cause of William III. Losing in battle would have been a serious blow to James, but losing before the battle had even begun sundered almost all hope that James had of maintaining the crown. In the following days, as the news spread, King James II is said to have suffered from a spree of nosebleeds, which continues to make historians ponder whether or not James suffered a nervous breakdown. And while a breakdown would make quite a lot of sense given the circumstances, the evidence that exists is scant and often contradictory. Now, by early December, James was forced to disband his forces. He disbanded them due to the rampant disloyalty of his soldiers, and this was another clear sign to all that the end was nigh for James's reign. Revolutionary riots bordering on celebration began in city after city from Cornwall to Sussex to Yorkshire. And as William's sobering Protestant march approached, King James sought to preserve what he had left of his family. He had his queen and young son escape to France on December 10th, but he himself stayed a little while longer for relatively ambiguous reasons. It is said that the next day James cast the Great Seal of the realm into the Thames as he attempted his own escape. And his wife and daughter did escape during their earlier attempt, but King James was captured and brought back to London and presided as king for a final week before the Prince of Orange finally arrived. And on December 17th, William and his army occupied London, but the task of revolution was not done. The question William now had to address was what exactly should he do with James? And execution was not even considered by William, which actually makes sense because he was an intelligent man who knew his history. Meaning William knew that the execution would have been a very unwise course because everyone in the British Isles still recalled, quite clearly, the English Civil War and when Charles I was executed. Wanting to avoid brutality and bloodshed for both political and moral reasons, William, with Mary's approval, sent James under Dutch guard out of London and to a coastal village where the guards were basically told to let James escape. The now former King James II took the hint and exiled himself from England for the rest of his life and joined his wife and son in France. Why did William allow James to escape? Well, I'll have that answer in just a second. With the business of military action done and done supremely well, I might add, William now had to deal with the business of state. Thus, the real political change caused by the English Revolution of 1688 began as William settled into the city and politics of London. And since James left of his own accord, according to the letter of the law, the monarchy was then in a legal state of interregnum. Interregnum is an ancient Latin word for when government is in limbo without an executive leader. And in this particular case, since the king abdicated the throne by willingly leaving his own country, this meant that a new monarch needed to be chosen. And yes, this was exactly the reason William let James escape. You might be asking why all this matters. Couldn't William just declare himself king and get on with it? And indeed he could, considering he had an army, but this was about politics. What I mean by that is, if William did that, he would not have the support of Parliament or the people, and as a newcomer to Britain, he wanted to keep up appearances. Why bother with all that, though? Well, that has to do a lot with tradition and customs, because while both he and his wife were in the line of succession, they were not the first in line for the throne. And William was wise enough to see that taking the monarchy by force was not a viable option because it would turn everyone in the country against his cause and almost certainly start another civil war. Thus, in order to ensure themselves of the throne, William and Mary played by the rules and adhered to English tradition by working with Parliament. So William re-established Parliament and held an untampered election in early January for the House of Commons. He then turned over the responsibility of choosing the next monarch to the Houses of Parliament. The debate continued into February with the House of Commons supporting William and Mary and the House of Lords contesting such a decision. And after almost 2 months of this interregnum, William met with parliamentary leaders in early February. In this private conversation, William told them up front that if he and his wife were not soon proclaimed monarchs, then he would pull out all military support suppressing open rebellion and simply leave England to the fate of the masses. This sobered Parliament up, and they agreed to have William and Mary proclaimed king and queen, with the next in the line of succession being Princess Anne and her future children. The Glorious Revolution was then coming to a close, but Parliament had requested that if William and Mary were to be proclaimed and vindicated, then they must accept what they called a Declaration of Rights. Part of the bill listed the grievances that King James II had violated as king, and the other part of the bill was the list of rights that could not be violated wherever Crown and Parliament ruled. This document is known today as the Bill of Rights of 1689. The document stated that the Crown did not have the power to suspend or enact laws without the consent of Parliament. The Crown could also not levy monies or maintain a standing army without parliamentary approval. Furthermore, the Bill of Rights of 1689 guaranteed the right to petition, and the 10th point of the bill states clearly, quote, that excessive bail ought not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishment inflicted, which is a legal phrase that is spread across most of the Western world. This Bill of Rights brings to mind two very important questions. Why was the Bill of Rights written, and what exactly was the impact of the Bill of Rights? There are several reasons why the Bill of Rights was written, especially why it was written at that exact time. Primarily, it was constructed to justify the fact that many Lords of Parliament had abandoned their king, an offense usually resulting in, of course, treason. But Parliament came out of the Glorious Revolution on the winning side, so they were the ones that were writing the history. Being the authors of the revolution, they needed to justify it. So that is why the Bill of Rights was written, and written the way it was. That is also why half of the 1689 Bill of Rights describes everything King James II did wrong and did illegally, because they needed to excuse themselves of overthrowing their king. As for the impact of the Bill of Rights, it seems like it would have been very important. Important because it guaranteed several rights and seemed to assert, as you might have noticed, that Parliament was of the same power statute as the Crown itself. But while all of that is perfectly logical, it quite frankly was not important for quite some time. I was actually going to say a long time, but it really wasn't too long. It only really took until the end of the 18th century for the Bill of Rights to truly resonate in a cultural, legal, and political sense within the British Empire. Why it occurred then is tied up in the age of revolution and nation building that began to spread after the 7 Years' War and the French and American Revolutions. And in the modern day, the 1689 Bill of Rights is incredibly important to many people and historians because it defined a shift in the Western world to constitutionally verifiable liberties that citizens were granted as what we know as rights. It is also important because for a very long time, over half a millennia, not much of the British constitutional or legal system was actually written down. It primarily functioned through tradition and precedent for the most part. Not to say that that is strange. In fact, having a written constitution is quite a recent historical occurrence. So, being a written legal document that affected the people at large and incidentally the future people of the British Empire, the Bill of Rights is seen correctly as important. Now one could, and many have, list many more reasons for and against the importance of the 1689 Bill, but that is a can of worms that I will leave sealed. In conclusion, we jump back to 1689. William and Mary accepted the Bill of Rights as an act of Parliament, and on February 13, 1689, William and Mary were subsequently proclaimed King and Queen of England, Scotland, and Ireland, and the English Revolution of 1688 was complete, giving William III leave to focus on the 9 Years' War.
Thank you very much.